until they run out of pasture and whatnot. It's a delight this morning during the occasion of our 200th anniversary for me to welcome James Trader, who's the curator of our treasure, the Cane Ridge Meeting House. He's going to be giving us a bit of our history by telling the Cane Ridge story, and allow some time towards the end for questions. James lives out there in the curator's home, taking care of the Cane Ridge grounds and of the meeting house itself. Of course, it's closed in the winter months except for a special appointment, but we're going to return out there as a congregation the last Saturday in June for Cane Ridge Day, which, thanks to the board of Cane Ridge, is going to focus on the history of Barton Stone in Lexington and in Central Christian Church in Georgetown. So we'll have an opportunity together to go out on a Saturday in June. Few other places I'd rather be than in Cane Ridge in the summertime. It is a beautiful place. James, of course, was preceded in the role of curator by the Steffers, who are Canadian disciples, and before them, our beloved Franklin McGuire, who was the first curator that I was blessed to meet back when I made my first pilgrimage, and that's what it is for disciples, a pilgrimage to Cane Ridge, in the mid-'80s with my church from St. Louis. We got a bus, and we made a trip of it and came over, and that's when I first met Franklin, and delighted in his love for that place. So, without any further ado, I'd like us to welcome at Central Christian Church, James Trader.
Thank you, David. People are waving at me already. Thank you for the invitation. I know a little of Central's history. If you look in the front of the Central Christian Church history that Tony Donovan did, in his acknowledgments, I'm right there. I was one of the people who helped him edit that thing, and in those days it was not as easy as it is now. We're operating on a 300 baud modem, for anybody who remembers those, and a dial-up, and we transferred a chapter at a time from his computer to my computer so that I could help him lay it out, and then we transferred it back to another Macintosh computer so that somebody could do the index. It was not exactly easy in those days.
Oh, gosh.
So I read parts of that many, many times. Now, my memory is probably not great. That was about 1990, as I recall. So a few things have happened since then. But it was a joy to work with Tony on that. Those of you who remember Tony, he was one of our disciple historians and dedicated to Cane Ridge. Wrote another book called Cane Ridge in Context. Wrote a couple of other books that dealt with disciple history as well. And I was privileged to be both a student and a colleague of his at the seminary. So my familiarity with that part is through Tony, actually. And it is a joy to be welcomed by you and to see Joyce McGuire, who is part of the legacy of Cane Ridge as well, having a brother who was curator, and many others who have been out there on many occasions. Cane Ridge is one of those places, I think, that draws people. And if you've been there, in fact, how many of you have been there? Okay. Didn't want to embarrass the others. Yeah, if you haven't been there, come, at least this summer when Central is there, because it is a special place for many, many reasons. I think when you walk on the grounds, you can feel that. Normally when I do this, I'm actually in the meeting house, and I get to turn around and point at things. It's a little harder. I've got a picture here, and if you can't see it from where you are, you can come up later and sort of get a feeling for it. But I will be referring to the meeting house and other things, so you may want to take a look at that. Barton Stone as well over here. Barton is one of my best friends. And Tony Donovan is buried on the grounds, and so is Barton Stone. So the three of us have many, many, many discussions. I almost always win. That was something nobody could say in the days when were actually around. Well, Daniel Boone named Cane Ridge. Called it Cane Ridge because there was cane growing on the ridge. It is not original, but it's descriptive. The cane we're talking about is a Native American bamboo. Not a very large variety. This type generally gets only about 15 or 18 feet tall. It isn't good for much of anything. It only gets about as big as my thumb, so you can't really build with it. They do say the cattle will eat it. It's not their favorite, but in the winter, it's one of the few things that's still green. And so they would graze on that when there wasn't much else to graze on. On Daniel Boone's advice, a group of Presbyterians came to Cane Ridge. They were settling in the area sometime in the late 1790 or early 1791. They had come from North Carolina, from the mountains there. Their minister was a man named Robert Finley. And we don't exactly know Boone's connection to Finley. We know they were acquainted. We also know they were born in the same part of Pennsylvania, up around Bucks County. But then they happened to both live in the same part of North Carolina. They're in the mountains, near Boone, actually. The Yadkin River Valley. So, somehow, this congregation traveled together. David, can you imagine getting all these people into a group and traveling that far across the mountains? You probably wouldn't want to lead them for long. Well, somehow they did. And remember, this was post-revolution. The ink on the Constitution was barely dry. This was a time in America for great exploration because the Revolutionary War had actually slowed the settlement of Kentucky. The people who were here, the fighters, went back home to fight. And it took a while for them to come back. But by 1790, things were starting to settle pretty quickly. The Indian threat was slowly going away in this part of Kentucky. It still had a few years to go, but for the most part, the Indians that were in this area, the Shawnee and the Cherokee, didn't live here all year round. They had semi-permanent settlements where they did a little farming, but it was mostly hunting. And the settlers started to vastly outnumber those Indians. Well, this congregation came in two parts, at least. We don't quite know. We know some came through the southern route, the Cumberland Gap, the Wilderness Road. Others came by the northern route, the water route, getting off at what was called Limestone Landing in those days, Maysville today. That was how you got here from the north. Somehow, these two groups found their way to Cane Ridge in Bourbon County. Now that's a pretty impressive feat for them to all manage to get to the same place. There weren't as many roads as we have today, and there probably weren't that many trail markers. But most everything came to central Kentucky. You had to pretty much get through the bluegrass to get anywhere else. If you were headed west, you still came through here. That's why Highway 68, the old national road, ran the way it did, coming down from Maysville and heading west. There was also a northern national road that went up through Ohio. But if you wanted to get west through Kentucky, that was the route you took, even before it became Highway 68, the first macadamized road in the state, paving in those days. Well, this group found Cane Ridge on Daniel Boone's advice, and they found a ridge covered in cane. They say something like 15 to 17 miles worth of cane. And cane is a dense, woody grass. It takes over wherever you let it. The patches we've allowed to grow on the ridge today, after it had been cleared all those years ago, are a real pain. And if anybody wants any of it, you're welcome to come out. I will hand you the shovel myself, because you have to dig it out. If you cut it or burn it, it still comes back.
Wow.
It is a true nuisance. You have to get rid of it in order to farm. Well, there may have been a blight on the cane in the 1790s. We're not quite sure. I found one reference in one letter that there was a blight. We cannot corroborate it yet. But it seems likely that would have helped to clear the cane. Well, they first built their homes. And that's a little unusual. Most groups that travel together would have built a large structure like a barn or a church. And then they would have all stayed there together to protect each other. And then they would have helped each other build their homes out from that somewhere. But this group did it the other way around. They started building their own homes, and then they came together in 1791 to build the meeting house. We're not quite sure why. We just assumed they were an ornery bunch of Presbyterians, and that's how they were going to do it. They built this meeting house in about 9 months. It's believed to be the largest single-room log structure in the country. It is roughly 30 by 50 feet, almost 30 feet to the peak of the roof. That is unnecessarily tall. It's hard to get a feeling for the true dimensions of the building here. And now that we've enclosed it in the shrine, it's even harder to really get that feeling from a distance. But until you get a person in the picture, it's very difficult. Just think about the height of that door. It's actually a little shorter than most people are today. That's not because they were short. That's the rumor, but it's not true. It's because we keep putting floors in there and they keep building up one on the other. The doors get shorter because of that. The building is made of blue ash logs. Blue ash is one of the hardest of the Kentucky hardwoods. It is so hard, in fact, that termites don't like it. One reason it's still there. It is a wood that hardens even as it ages, so that eventually it is almost petrified. In fact, you have to pre-drill pretty much any hole you put in it today. I broke 2 drill bits in one day trying to put a plaque on the wall. It's that dense. It is one of the woods they use not only for cabins but for flooring. And one of the reasons we don't have much of it left today is because it was in high demand in those days. It tends to age in sort of a silvery blue. When you go inside the shrine today, you'll see it looks a little blue. Part of that is because the windows are blue, and it changes the light inside. But it has no center support. 50 feet by 30 feet, and it's all supported by the walls. That's quite a feat in those days. That allows them, however, to have that huge open center space. We do have a balcony inside, and it has posts to support it, but they don't support the roof. The roof is made of hand-split oak shingles. The ones we have today are probably not original by any means. We have no idea how often or how many times that roof was replaced. But it is still hand-split oak shingles, which is quite a feat in and of itself. All those logs were harvested from the area. They say that the cane was so dense that the men were out there looking for blue ash, and they would sometimes get a little turned around. Not always quite know how to get back to the meeting house. Now, Daniel Boone said once that he was never lost, but he was a mite confused on a couple of occasions. So these men would have to climb a tree to look back to see where the meeting house was, so they could bring that log back. See, ladies, men didn't ask for directions even in those days. And there were probably 1 or 2 of the wives who told their husband to go climb a tree. That's a whole other issue. The wood took a long time to work because it was so hard. And if you'll notice, those are not round logs. They are squared off. That is a very difficult thing to do with hard wood, using the tools that they had at hand. There weren't any mills set up yet. We know they probably had a pit saw somewhere on site. That is, a saw that ran vertically, that you had a pit you walked in, and it was like a crosscut saw, and somebody below would be doing this while somebody up top would be doing this. And the guy below got a face full of sawdust all the time, probably wore a broad brim hat so that it would keep some of it out of his eyes, but it was not an easy task. They also used froes and mauls. They used an adze and an axe and crosscut saw, so that every one of those was actually fit on site. The corners that are put together are made with what technically is called an inverted V-notch, or an upside down V. Now, around here, we call it a saddle notch, because it's the law in Kentucky, everything has to deal with the horse somehow. Some places, they call it a cathedral notch, because there is a point at the top. And in Pennsylvania, I'm told they call it a German notch. There's probably a dozen other names out there, but that shape, that upside down V shape, the more weight you put on it, the stronger it gets. The less likely those boards will twist apart. And that keeps them in place. It does a couple of other things too, one of which is it keeps the water from settling. If you had a flat notch, water would probably sit there and eventually rot through. But by having that upside down V shape, it sheds off each piece. And if all that's not enough, they would then drill down through those corners. And they'd put in oak pegs, 3 and 4 feet long, an inch to an inch and a half thick. You've heard the expression putting a square peg into a round hole. Believe it or not, that's what they did. They didn't quite make the peg small enough for the hole so that they would actually have to drive it down with a hammer, and that would shave off the edges of that peg, and it would fit perfectly into that hole so that those things don't move. That building, they say, hasn't shifted more than an inch and a half since it was built in 1791. I bet you can't say that about this building. I know that part's new, so it's probably still working on settling. Well, the building has other unique features. Here in the center, you see what we call the alcove, or the offset. That is a necessary function of the building. You would hear some people tell you that it was done to form the shape of a cross. And while that's true, had that been their intent, I think those arms would have been wider. You'll also hear people tell you it gives you 12 corners for the 12 apostles. The Mulkey Meeting House was done the same way, and they make that claim. However, that's an awful lot of work to make one point. It's actually very much an architectural feature. You see, that's a 50-foot long wall. If you found a straight tree that was 50 feet tall, and you managed to knock it down, square it up, and then lift it into place, you've probably done about 3 impossible things in one day. The truth is, this gives you 3 logs to equal the same length, 10, 20, and 20. That requires it to be slightly offset, but it's a very intelligent thing, not just for the length, but for the strength of the wall. If you were to say stand a piece of paper up on its side, it's going to fall over. But if you find a piece of corrugated cardboard, it will probably stand upright. And that's the same thing. Those alcoves allow us to have the pulpit on one side that is slightly recessed. But I don't know that they were particularly thinking of building a pulpit alcove either. It started with a dirt floor. It had no windows, and there was no chinking between the logs. That means the air came through that building summer and winter, no matter what. There's a description of a cabin that was built down the road at the same time, what they called the Log Cabin Seminary, where their minister Robert Finley taught. The description says that it had spacing between the logs so wide that you didn't have need of light. That's a porous building. Now, I do suspect, although they don't write about this anywhere, I suspect they hung quilts and canvas to keep the wind down. I think if you were sitting next to that, you would put up a quilt beside yourself. I suspect that in the middle of the winter, they probably stuffed some stuff in some of those holes too. But one reason they didn't was so that they could actually look through the walls in the case of Indian attack. Now, they were never attacked there. Don't come out looking for the bullet holes, they don't exist. But there was a chance in the early days that the Indians might attack there. However, the Shawnee and the Cherokee were not particularly interested in the buildings. They tended to more attack people in the fields. If you were out by yourself plowing the ground, that's when to attack, not when they would have rifles at each wall during the services. You'd probably have 4 people assigned to stand and watch during those early days, just to make sure nobody was coming to attack. You think you have it difficult getting to church some Sundays. You just don't know what trouble is. Well, in 1796, that Indian threat had pretty much gone away. And so about that time is when they put the chinking in between the logs, and they cut the windows in and put on those shutters. That made it a little more comfortable to come to church. But there was still no heat source inside, not for many years. You came bundled up. And as difficult as that may sound, they lived the same way. You only had a fire going in the fireplace if you were cooking in general. So you kept a pot of water on at least, and probably something on a spit over the fire throughout the day, so that you would have heat in the building. Remember how dangerous an open fire in a wood cabin, chinked and mortared with mud, really was. Well, the dirt floor in 1796 was covered with puncheon logs. Those are half logs, the round side on the bottom, flat side on top. It's like walking in a fun house if you've ever tried it. Nothing stays steady. You cannot brace it well enough. They sat on puncheon logs as well, again, half logs, 4 legs, no back. Imagine sitting on that during one of David's 3-hour sermons.
Yes.
Better hope he's interesting that day. Well, they made small improvements through the years. They had put in a balcony to begin with. The balcony is a freestanding balcony. It is not attached to the walls anywhere except for the hand railings. There were no stairs in those days. They climbed ladders through those upper windows on the ends. And that's where the slaves used to sit. And that ladder probably wasn't attached to the walls. It was loose. Ladies, even the slave women who sat there would have been wearing long dresses and probably carrying children. Theirs and the white children, most likely, who they'd be taking care of. And so it was a rather dangerous proposition getting in and out, and something we don't generally think of. They pulled that ladder up after themselves, just in case they were attacked, so that nobody could come in that way either. Again, we don't think about some of these kinds of things today. Well, they went through numerous changes in the building. In 1829, they removed what they called the slaves' gallery. You see, this congregation had freed most of their slaves by then, and they were generally sitting in the main building with everyone else on the main floor. They also decided to make some more comfortable improvements. They brought in a second set of pews, that is, a plank pew with one board across the back. We got one of those at the ridge so you can see it, the last remaining pew. Not too comfortable, but at least you had something to lean against. They put in a tongue and groove floor right on top of those old puncheon logs They plastered the walls on the inside and put weatherboarding on the outside. Painted it white. Looked like all the other little country churches in the area. In fact, over the years, people began to forget there was even a log building inside the walls. They put in large glass windows, sash windows, enlarged those holes that you see there. That meant it let in a lot more light, and you could still keep the wind out. Now, there's some discrepancy as to when the pot-bellied stove came in. One source says 1829, one says 1882. I'm leaning toward the 1829 just because I want to be warm, but we think that's when it may have come in. The pot-bellied stove sat right in the center of the room. Well, they continued until 1882. They had removed that balcony and put in a ceiling so that it was a little easier to heat down below. They had also changed out what they were using as tallow candle chandeliers for oil lamp chandeliers in 1882. They changed the orientation inside, moved the pulpit to this far end, to the eastern side, and all the pews faced in one direction rather than being sort of in a round. They had a center aisle around the pot-bellied stove and brought in brand new pews, the ones we use today. And those of you who've been there will tell you they're not that comfortable. They're a whole lot better than what they had. It's not quite like the padded pews most people want today. They didn't have that argument about what color to make the cushions or the carpet because they didn't use either one of those. But it got a little more comfortable. Still was a rather straight kind of seat. Well, the congregation continued until 1921, and that's when they had to close their doors. Despite what some of our brothers and sisters in the Church of Christ think, the organ was not the reason that they closed. They did bring in an organ in 1882, a pump organ. We have one like it today. It's not the original. The original disappeared. But then in 1921, there just simply was no way they could afford a full-time pastor. They hadn't had one for many years. It was not a large congregation, and in fact, that area of Kentucky was never the highest populated area. So they closed. The members scattered to other churches around North Middletown and Paris, Millersburg, and Carlisle. The building, though, was still there. It was not particularly well taken care of for a few years, but it was still used for an occasional hymn sing or a special service. And it had been a pilgrimage site since the early 1800s because of the things that had happened there. So people were still coming by. The Clays next door kept the key on the back porch under a little sign that said, "Key." I got that sign in the museum. It was not as much of a concern in those days to keep it that secure. I've talked to all kinds of kids who grew up along Cane Ridge Road, and they held mock weddings, and they preached from that pulpit, and they did a few other things in the house that we probably shouldn't repeat. But it was visited regularly. Well, they remembered that things had happened there that we needed to remember. So in 1932, they restored the building to what you see today. That building was in good condition as far as the structure went, but it did have to have some cosmetic work done. All the things they'd added came off, and they returned it roughly to what it would have looked like in about 1796. And that balcony that had been removed was found in a barn down the road, where it had been used as a hayloft for 100 years. And when they brought it back, they say it fit perfectly. I've noticed one or two places where they had to shave a piece or two, and there are 3 posts that had to be replaced. But by and large, it is the original balcony. Problem is, it stands out there on a ridge. The highest point in the county is just uphill from us. It is an area that the weather gets to, especially at this time of year. And they knew it wasn't going to last out there for another generation. Something had to be done. So in the 1950s, they finally got together a plan and some money. It would still take a while to raise the rest of it. But in 1954, they began the outer structure that covers that. It's made of golden Cane Ridge limestone. That's only found that color within about a 7 to 12 mile radius of Cane Ridge. They put on slate roof, 50 tons on top of 3-inch gypsum panels. The flooring in there came from Jessamine County down by the Kentucky River. So it is a relatively native building. That cost us just about $120,000 in 1957 when it was completed. $20,000 over budget, like all good church projects are. It probably would have cost a lot more if we'd been trying to build in a city somewhere. They used a lot of local people, a lot of masons and trainees, apprentices from the area. Well, that has protected the building. Just this year, we did have the exterior trim painted again. Radden, I think most of you know the Raddens, did the job. And we have just asked them to paint the interior for the first time in who knows how many years. So sometime after April, they will do that and spiff up that building. But that stone building needs a little work other than that on an occasional basis. Well, why did we bother to save something like that out in the middle of Bourbon County? People ask us sometimes why we didn't move the building, why we didn't come into Lexington or something, you know, put it right next to Central so that everybody would come and find it. And we tell them it's always been there. It was always hard to find. So why should we bother to change that? You see, a pilgrimage requires that you go somewhere and do something. And so that's what people are doing out there. This congregation was relatively united. Now, you know, it was a congregation, so you know, with all disciples, we know where 2 or 3 are gathered, there are 3 or 4 opinions. And that was probably true with this bunch as well. But for the most part, they got along pretty well. Some of them did move farther west over the years. Cane Ridge and the Bluegrass actually were great stopping places. It took a lot of effort to get across the mountains. Once you made it into Kentucky, your supplies were gone. And it took some time to rebuild that. And others were simply trying to outpace society. They left the east, where they say if you could see the smoke from your neighbor's chimney, they were too close. They were coming to Kentucky to find a space. And then Kentucky started to get crowded again. And so they moved farther west, Missouri and Illinois in particular. Well, Robert Finley, the congregation's pastor, was pretty well liked. He served there in the Concord congregation just outside of Carlisle, or what is Carlisle today. He taught in the Log Cabin Seminary, a quarter mile to the east of Cane Ridge. The problem is, Robert Finley apparently was a little fond of an alcoholic beverage or two. They say that in 1796, he was accused by the presbytery of not being able to sit his horse. That is almost a DUI. We're not quite sure what happened first, whether the presbytery and the synod told him to leave, or he said goodbye first. But he left. Moved up to Chillicothe, Ohio. They say he became a Methodist and sobered up. Don't know which happened first. But he had 2 sons who later went on to become Methodist pastors as well. So apparently it took. He was actually allowed back on site during the Great Revival of 1801, where they say he preached. So apparently he was forgiven. But that left the church in desperate need. They needed a pastor. And it just so happened that a young man named Barton Warren Stone was there in the area. Stone was a fresh graduate. He was not exactly looking forward to settling and serving as pastor. He came out of Port Tobacco, Maryland. I know you all know exactly where that is. If you look at a map and find DC, jump the river and it's over there. It has another claim to fame. Anyone familiar with the name of Mudd? The man who shot President Lincoln? His broken leg was set by Dr. Mudd in Port Tobacco. And he was captured in a barn not far outside of Port Tobacco. Port Tobacco is kind of barely there today. It was a shallow water port. And as the colonies grew, so did the boats. And they simply could not harbor in these shallow water ports. And so, as quickly as it was founded and populated, it suddenly fell out of favor. Well, Barton Stone's cousin Thomas lived there as well. Thomas was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, the third signature below John Hancock. Thomas's home there today has been restored and is a national park. Thomas was one of the youngest signers of the Declaration. Well, Stone's family was pretty well connected. His great-great-grandfather was the first Protestant governor of Maryland, which had been a Catholic colony. And his mother was related to the Earl of Surrey in England. They were connected, but they didn't have huge amounts of money. And when Barton was only 3 and a half, his father died. And his mother had to make some hard choices. She had family living in Virginia, adult children there from a previous marriage, and they could help her take care of these young children. Barton got his first 5 years of education there in Virginia, and when he was old enough to receive the inheritance he had coming, he spent it on more education. Went to North Carolina, to the Guilford Academy, near present-day Greensboro, where a man named David Caldwell was teaching school. Caldwell was a Presbyterian preacher. He was also many other things. He'd studied the law. He was a Revolutionary War veteran. And he was a self-taught physician. Think about that one. Believe it or not, he did that by correspondence. Internet ain't got nothing new on us today. He was said to be the best physician for miles around. He may have been the only one, but he was the best. Well, a lot of Presbyterian ministers were trained in this academy. Barton Stone actually went there to study the law. Frankly, it's what the family had always done. It's where the money was. He was an Anglican as a child, baptized Anglican, but not all that observant. So he went to this school. He had enough money for 3 years. He had very carefully budgeted out, and he knew he couldn't dilly-dally while he was there. Some of his classmates were attending services and revivals. He thought he didn't have the time. He needed to study to get through in 3 years. Somehow somebody talked him into attending a revival, and it bothered him. He was still not quite sure what he believed or how he believed, but it bothered him. These other